The Unsettled Duke. The grand ballroom of Blackwood Manor, usually a sanctuary of refined quietude, now pulsed with an almost electric anticipation. Hours before his wedding to Lady Eleanor, Duke Alistair stood by a towering window, the last vestiges of the afternoon sun catching the intricate embroidery on his waistcoat. He should have felt a profound sense of accomplishment, a deep satisfaction in the culmination of duty and expectation. Instead, a subtle, persistent disquiet gnawed at him, an unfamiliar discord in the otherwise perfect symphony of his life. He ran a gloved hand over the cool glass, the panorama of his ancestral lands stretching out, verdant and ordered, just like his future. Guests began to arrive, a shimmering tide of silks, jewels, and whispered pleasantries. Alistair watched them from his slightly elevated position, a silent observer in his own prenuptial celebration. His gaze, accustomed to dissecting crowds with cool efficiency, moved from one familiar face to another, searching perhaps for an explanation for his burgeoning unease. Then, amidst the dazzling display of society's elite, his eyes snagged. She stood near the periphery, a quiet eddy in the swirling current of conversation. Her gown, a simple slate grey, was utterly devoid of adornment, its only embellishment the subtle drape of good wool. No diamonds sparkled at her throat, no plumes danced in her hair. She was simply there. Miss Clara Thorne, he recalled, a companion to his distant cousin, Lady Agatha. He'd glimpsed her before, a fleeting shadow, but never truly seen her. Clara, acutely aware of the Duke's scrutinizing gaze, felt a familiar prickle of discomfort. She kept her expression neutral, a practiced shield against the often unwanted attentions of the ton. She observed him in turn, not with the simpering awe or eager deference displayed by so many, but with a quiet, almost clinical interest. He was, undeniably, magnificent in his tailored finery, his posture impeccable, his dark hair precisely styled. Yet, beneath the veneer of aristocratic perfection, she sensed a flicker of something unsettled, a faint tension in the set of his jaw. She did not curtsy deeply, nor did she offer the customary ingratiating smile. Such gestures felt hollow, performative, and Clara had no talent for pretense. She merely met his gaze for a fraction longer than polite society dictated, her own eyes, the colour of moss after rain, holding an unreadable depth. Alistair felt an unexpected jolt. It wasn't merely her lack of artifice, but the directness of her gaze, devoid of either admiration or disdain. It was honest. He found himself dissecting the nuances of her composure. She wasn't shy, not precisely. There was a quiet strength in her stance, a self-possession that seemed utterly unaffected by her modest attire or her subordinate position. The unease that had been a vague hum within him now sharpened, coalescing around this one quiet woman. Lady Eleanor, radiant in a gown of ivory satin, glided towards him, her smile a perfect arc of grace. "Alistair, my dear, you seem rather preoccupied. Are you not enjoying the festivities?" Her voice was a melody of cultured refinement, her hand a soft, reassuring weight on his arm. He turned, the momentary fascination with Miss Thorne swiftly suppressed. "Forgive me, Eleanor, merely lost in thought. The grandeur of it all is quite overwhelming." He offered a practiced smile, a mask he wore with effortless ease. He watched as Eleanor greeted guests, her every movement a lesson in aristocratic propriety. She was the ideal Duchess, intelligent, poised, and utterly without blemish. Yet, a faint whisper of hollowness echoed in his chest. His eyes, against his better judgment, strayed back to Clara Thorne. She was now engaged in a low conversation with Lady Agatha, her head tilted slightly, a rare, soft smile playing on her lips. It was a genuine smile, Alistair realised with a peculiar jolt, one that didn't feel manufactured for an audience. He found himself wondering about the quiet woman, about the thoughts behind those calm, intelligent eyes. It was an inappropriate fascination, he knew, bordering on the scandalous given the proximity of his wedding. He should dismiss it, eradicate it from his mind as one might a stray, inconvenient thought. Yet he couldn't. Alistair felt a strange, almost defiant surge of curiosity. He was the Duke of Blackwood, a man accustomed to having his desires met. And at this moment, an inexplicable, compelling desire to understand Miss Clara Thorne had taken root, threatening to disrupt the perfectly cultivated landscape of his life. He watched her for a few more moments, the unadorned woman in the simple grey dress, feeling the nascent stirrings of something dangerous and utterly captivating. His wedding, the culmination of his life's path, loomed, but a new, unbidden path was suddenly, irrevocably illuminated. A spark of defiance. The clatter of carriage wheels and the distant murmur of arriving guests did little to quell the unusual disquiet stirring within Alistair. Hours, merely hours, until he was bound to Lady Eleanor. Yet his gaze kept straying, not to the preparations or the nervous servants, but to the woman by the conservatory window. Miss Clara Thorne, a companion to Lady Agatha, stood apart, a quiet sentinel amidst the flurry. Her profile, illuminated by the pale morning light, held an unyielding quality, a subtle defiance that was both perplexing and undeniably captivating. He watched her for a long moment, the delicate curve of her neck, the way she seemed utterly unconcerned with the grand affair unfolding around her. It was a stark contrast to the flattery and veiled ambitions he was accustomed to. A strange compulsion tugged at him, a desire to pierce that calm exterior, to see if anything could ruffle her composed demeanour. Dismissing his valet with a curt nod, he walked towards her, the scent of fresh-cut roses heavy in the air. "Miss Thorne," he began, his voice deeper than usual, the familiar authoritative cadence laced with an unfamiliar edge of curiosity. Clara turned, her eyes the colour of deep moss, meeting his without a flicker of apprehension. "Your Grace." Her voice was low, devoid of the simpering tones he usually heard from women of her station. There was no curtsy, no deferential dip of the head, merely a direct, unwavering gaze. It was a challenge, he realised, as clear as any shouted declaration. Alistair felt a jolt, an almost physical sensation that ran through him. He was Duke Alistair, a man whose word was law, whose presence commanded instant respect. And here was a woman who offered none of the expected platitudes. "You seem unoccupied by the morning's festivities." His tone was sharper than he intended, a ripple of irritation at her composure. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. "One can only admire so many arrangements of lilies, Your Grace, before one begins to ponder the ephemeral nature of all things." The response was entirely unexpected, delivered with a dry wit that caught him off guard. It was an intellectual parry, not a fawning agreement. An electric current seemed to spark between them, a silent clash of his power and her quiet, unyielding strength. He felt an inexplicable urge to prolong the exchange, to dissect her words, to understand the mind behind those unsettlingly calm eyes. Indeed, Alistair found himself leaning slightly closer, a gesture of intimacy he hadn't offered another woman in years. And what, pray tell, do you find more enduring? Clara's gaze drifted past him towards the distant stables, then back to his face. Truth, perhaps, though it is often the most inconvenient of companions. The air thickened, charged with an unspoken tension. He studied her, searching for any sign of artifice, but found none. Her honesty, however barbed, was refreshing, almost intoxicating. He was a man accustomed to artifice and manipulation, and her directness was like a splash of cold water. The sound of Lady Agatha's voice, a reedy call from the drawing-room, broke the spell. "Clara, my dear, come assist me with these ribbons." Clara inclined her head minimally. "If you will excuse me, Your Grace." With that, she turned and walked away, her departure as unhurried and self-possessed as her arrival. Alistair watched her go, a strange mix of frustration and fascination churning within him. He was hours from marrying Lady Eleanor, a woman of impeccable breeding and suitable fortune, a woman he respected. Yet he felt no such intense pull towards her. With Clara, however, there was an inexplicable draw, a desire to observe her, to provoke her, to understand the quiet fire that burned beneath her composed exterior. It was an unsettling, disruptive feeling, one that he knew instinctively would not be easily dismissed. The memory of her moss-green eyes and her sharp wit clung to him, a persistent echo in the grand, quiet halls of his impending wedding day. The carefully constructed order of his life felt, for the first time, precariously balanced. Broken decorum. The clinking of glasses and the murmur of polite conversation filled the ballroom, a symphony of well-bred tedium. Alistair, theoretically engaged in discussing trade routes with a portly baron, felt his gaze drift past the glittering chandeliers, past the swirling silks of dancing couples, to a quiet alcove near the conservatory doors. There, amidst the vibrant display of exotic ferns, sat Miss Thorne, her profile illuminated by the soft glow of a nearby sconce. She was reading, as always, a small volume held delicately in her gloved hands. His fiancée, Lady Eleanor, a vision in sapphire blue, was currently captivating a cluster of dowagers with her effortless grace. He should have been at her side, fulfilling his ducal duties, yet a strange, insistent pull drew him towards the woman who offered no flattery, no simpering smiles. Breaking away from the Baron with a curt apology, Alistair navigated the crowded room, a path opening before him as lesser mortals instinctively made way for the Duke. He reached the alcove, and Clara, sensing his presence, slowly lowered her book. Her eyes, the colour of moss after a spring rain, met his. There was no surprise, no flutter of eyelashes, only that familiar, unnerving steadiness. "Miss Thorne," Alistair began, his voice a low rumble. "I trust you are finding the evening diverting." It was a clumsy opening, far from his usual polished ease. Clara merely arched a brow. "The botanical specimens are quite remarkable, Your Grace. Their resilience, in particular." She gestured vaguely towards a struggling orchid. Alistair almost smiled. "Indeed. A quality one seldom finds in human company, it seems." He leaned against the marble pillar framing the alcove, effectively blocking her easy exit. "I must confess, I find myself drawn to conversations that offer something beyond the usual pleasantries." Across the room, a cluster of young women paused their animated chatter, their eyes darting towards the Duke and the companion. Whispers began, a soft, venomous hiss that slithered through the air. Mrs. Finch, perched on a velvet chaise like a formidable gargoyle, observed the scene with narrowed eyes, a faint, almost imperceptible twitch at the corner of her lips. "And what, pray tell, does your Grace find lacking in pleasantries?" Clara asked, her tone even, though a hint of challenge flickered in her gaze. "Authenticity," he replied, surprising himself with a bluntness. "A rare commodity, wouldn't you agree?" Clara closed her book, her gaze unwavering. "Authenticity often comes at a price, Your Grace. One not everyone is willing to pay." Just then the music swelled, a lively jig, and a debutante in frothy pink stumbled near the alcove, her eyes wide as she registered the Duke's proximity to Miss Thorne. The whispers intensified. Alistair, acutely aware of the scrutiny, felt a perverse satisfaction. He was deliberately breaking a minor social rule, engaging in an extended private conversation with a companion when he should have been attending to his fiancée. It felt liberating. Over the following days, a subtle shift occurred. A single perfect camellia, a shade of rose blush, appeared on Clara's dressing table one morning. It was an unusual bloom for the season, its petals impossibly soft. Later that week, a slim volume of Lord Byron's poetry, a first edition with a leather binding, materialized amongst her modest collection of books. The gifts were anonymous, of course, delivered by a footman who merely stated they were from an admirer. Clara, for her part, received them with a quiet dignity, her expression giving nothing away. Yet Alistair imagined her reaction. Did she wonder who sent them? Did the delicate scent of the camellia linger on her fingers? Did she trace the elegant script of the poetry? He found himself conjuring images of her, alone in her room, a rare smile gracing her lips, or perhaps a frown of bewilderment. He wanted to elicit a reaction, a flicker of emotion beyond her usual composed reserve. He saw her across the breakfast room the day after the poetry arrived, conversing quietly with Lady Agatha. He searched her face for any sign, any indication that she had received his latest offering. Her expression remained impassive, her eyes serene. A strange frustration, sharp and unexpected, pricked at him. He was a duke, accustomed to women fawning, to their eager displays of gratitude. Yet Miss Thorne remained an enigma, a challenge he found himself increasingly desperate to unravel. Mrs. Finch, observing him from behind her teacup, let out a soft harumph. "Duke looks like a cat contemplating a particularly stubborn mouse," she muttered to no one in particular. Never a good sign, that. She then took a loud theatrical slurp of her tea, her gaze fixed on Clara. Though some mice, bless their clever little hearts, are harder to catch than others. Whispers and avoidance. Clara felt the weight of the Duke's gaze even before she saw him. It was a familiar, unwelcome pressure that had intensified with each passing day, each stolen moment. She moved through the drawing room, a blur of muted grey amongst the vibrant silks and rustling satins, her movements precise and quick as she arranged a vase of late-blooming roses. The scent of them, heavy and sweet, seemed to mock her attempts at invisibility. She heard the low murmur of his voice, too close for comfort, and felt a flush rise to her cheeks. Lady Agatha, thankfully, was deeply engaged in a discussion about the merits of different embroidery stitches with Mrs. Davies, blissfully unaware of Clara's growing unease. "Miss Thorne?" Alistair's voice was a low rumble, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards. It held a proprietary note that sent a shiver down her spine, not of delight, but of apprehension. He stood a mere foot away, his dark blue coat a stark contrast to her simple gown. She could feel the warmth radiating from him, an almost palpable heat. Clara turned slowly, her expression carefully neutral. "Your Grace." Her tone was clipped, formal, a barrier she hoped would prove impenetrable. She had spent the morning perfecting the art of the polite dismissal, the subtle turn of the head, the perfectly timed excuse to attend to Lady Agatha. Yet his persistence was a relentless tide, chipping away at her resolve. "You vanish like a particularly elusive sprite, Miss Thorne," he observed, a hint of amusement in his eyes that only fueled her irritation. "One might think you were actively avoiding me." "Hardly, Your Grace," Clara replied, her voice steady despite the thrumming in her veins. "My duties to Lady Agatha are, as ever, my primary concern." She gestured vaguely towards the far end of the room, where Lady Agatha was now demonstrating a complex knot to Mrs. Davies. He merely smiled, a slow, knowing curve of his lips that made her stomach clench. "Indeed, a most diligent companion." His gaze lingered, a silent question in its depth, and Clara felt a sudden, desperate urge to flee. The marriage was but hours away. The thought was a cold splash of water, reminding her of the absolute impropriety of this interaction. Meanwhile, a different kind of ripple was spreading through the gilded salons and hushed corners of society. Mrs. Finch, a formidable woman with an uncanny ability to dissect and disseminate information, had been particularly active. Her pronouncements, delivered with an air of grave concern, carried the weight of impending scandal. "Such peculiar behaviour," Mrs. Finch confided to Lady Selina over cups of tepid tea, her voice barely a whisper, yet carrying across the room with surprising clarity. "The Duke, you see, quite fixated on Miss Thorne. A plain girl, if you ask me, entirely unremarkable." The whispers, initially faint, grew into a murmuring chorus. The Duke, a man known for his impeccable decorum and unwavering focus, was observed to be distracted. His eyes, meant to be solely for his radiant fiancée, were too often seen straying, seeking out the quiet corner where Miss Thorne often sat, a book in her hands. The news, distorted and embellished with each retelling, eventually found its way to Lady Eleanor. She sat in her private salon, a vision in sapphire blue silk, her maid carefully arranging a spray of pearls in her auburn hair. The room was filled with the scent of lavender and anticipation. Lady Eleanor had been basking in the glow of her impending nuptials, the culmination of years of careful planning and impeccable social navigation. When Mrs. Davies, flushed and flustered, gently broached the subject, Lady Eleanor's elegant features hardened almost imperceptibly. "Such nonsense, Mrs. Davies," she said, her voice cool and measured, though a faint tremor ran through her hand as she adjusted a pearl earring. "The Duke is merely being civil. Miss Thorne is, after all, a guest." But the seeds of doubt had been planted. Lady Eleanor, usually so composed, found her thoughts returning to the innocuous interactions she had witnessed, the lingering glances she had dismissed as mere absent-mindedness. The image of Alastair's eyes, so often distant in her presence, now seemed to hold a flicker of something she couldn't quite name when they rested on Clara. It was an unwelcome intrusion, a discordant note in the symphony of her perfect wedding day. The fiancé's gaze. The scent of beeswax polish and aging parchment usually filled Eleanor with a comforting sense of her impending domesticity. But today, even the familiar aroma of the ducal library felt brittle. Sunlight, a pale yellow through the tall windows, illuminated dust motes dancing in the air, mirroring the unsettled particles of her own mind. She watched Alistair across the room, ostensibly poring over ledgers with his estate manager. His brow was furrowed, not with the usual concentration of a man managing vast holdings, but with a vacant intensity, as if his gaze pierced through the numbers to some distant, unseen object. The rumours, once dismissed as the idle whispers of the ton, had begun to coalesce into an undeniable truth. At first she'd laughed, a delicate tinkling sound that implied such gossip was beneath her notice. Alistair, after all, was hers. Their union was a foregone conclusion, a masterpiece of strategic alliance and social grace. But now, the laughter felt hollow. He ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture of impatience rather than deep thought. His usual sharp attention to detail, a quality Eleanor had always admired as befitting a duke, seemed to have evaporated. He nodded absently to a question from the manager, his eyes drifting towards the window, then to the closed door, as if anticipating an arrival. This was not the man who had meticulously overseen the refurbishment of the north wing, nor the one who had debated the finer points of agricultural rotation with such robust conviction. This was a man preoccupied, his focus fractured, his very essence subtly altered. Lord Harrington, perched on the edge of a mahogany desk, observed Alistair with an amused, if slightly knowing expression. One might imagine the Duke is contemplating the profound mysteries of the universe, rather than the quarterly yields of his wheat fields, he remarked, his voice a low murmur meant only for Eleanor. He took a sip of claret, his eyes glinting over the rim of the glass. Or perhaps a mystery far less universal and considerably more singular. Eleanor's spine stiffened, though she maintained her serene composure. Alistair has much on his mind, Lord Harrington. The wedding preparations alone are considerable. Harrington merely smiled, a slight twitch at the corner of his lips. Indeed. And yet, one might posit that the preparations he finds most consuming are of a rather unconventional nature. He paused, allowing the implication to settle. Such distractions can be costly in more ways than one. Alistair, oblivious to their hushed exchange, suddenly pushed away from the table, a sigh escaping him. "That will be all for now, Davies," he said, his voice clipped. "I shall review these figures later." Davies, accustomed to the Duke's methodical approach, looked momentarily surprised but bowed and retreated. Alistair turned, and for a fleeting moment his eyes met Eleanor's. There was no warmth, no flicker of the affection that usually resided there. Instead, his gaze was distant, almost opaque, as if she were merely another piece of furniture in the opulent room. Then his attention snapped away, drawn by the faint sound of carriage wheels on the gravel outside. Eleanor felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. It was true then. Every whispered insinuation, every knowing glance, every thinly veiled jest. He was neglecting his duties, his impending marriage, all for her. The thought was a bitter pill. She, Lady Eleanor, the epitome of ducal grace, was being overlooked. She watched him stride towards the window, pulling back the heavy velvet curtain with an almost desperate eagerness. His face, usually a mask of aristocratic control, was now alight with an anticipation that bordered on boyish. A flicker of proprietary amusement crossed his features as he observed something, or someone, in the drive below. It was an expression Eleanor had never seen directed at her, an unguarded joy that stung more deeply than any open insult. "Alistair," she began, her voice carefully modulated, attempting to reclaim his attention, to draw him back to their shared reality. He turned, his smile still present, though it faded slightly upon seeing her. "Eleanor," he acknowledged, the syllable flat, devoid of the familiar endearment. His eyes, however, were already drifting back to the window, to whatever captivating spectacle lay beyond the pane. The subtle shifts in his demeanour were no longer subtle. They were a stark, undeniable declaration. The fiancée's gaze, once filled with the serene confidence of her secured future, now held only a chilling certainty of its imminent unravelling. A tense encounter. The garden party at Lord Ashworth's estate was a kaleidoscope of pastel silks and hushed laughter, a delicate counterpoint to the thrumming tension that seemed to follow Alistair like a shadow. He found Clara near a trellis heavy with climbing roses, her dark hair a stark contrast to the blush-pink petals. She was speaking with a gaggle of older ladies, her expression one of polite endurance. A familiar amusement, sharp and proprietary, flickered through him. She was so captivating in her refusal to be impressed, her quiet strength a beacon in the sea of affected charm. He approached, cutting through a conversation about prize-winning dahlias with an ease that bordered on arrogance. Clara's eyes met his, a flicker of something unreadable, annoyance, resignation, before she offered a small, cool nod. "Miss Thorne," he murmured, his voice a low rumble that seemed to silence the chattering ladies around her. He ignored their sudden, breathless attention, his gaze fixed solely on Clara. "I trust you are enjoying the festivities?" "As much as one can, Your Grace," she replied, her tone even, betraying nothing. Her directness, a characteristic he found so refreshing, was a subtle barb in this company. Just then, Lady Eleanor glided into their periphery, a vision in lemon-yellow satin, her smile initially bright. It faltered slightly as she registered Alistair's intense focus on Clara. Mrs. Finch, a woman whose existence seemed dedicated to social cartography, was already a few paces behind Eleanor, her eyes darting between the Duke, Clara, and the Duchess-to-be, practically salivating at the unfolding drama. "Alistair, darling," Eleanor chimed, her voice a little too bright, a little too saccharine. She linked her arm through his, a possessive gesture that felt less like affection and more like a claim staked. "I was just looking for you. Lord Harrington has been quite charming, telling me all about his plans for the autumn hunt." Her eyes, a shade too cold, flickered to Clara. "And Miss Thorne, how delightful to see you again." The words were polite, but the underlying frost was unmistakable. Clara merely inclined her head, her gaze unwavering. "Lady Eleanor." Alistair felt the possessive grip on his arm, a gentle pressure that screamed ownership. He extracted himself with a subtlety that only heightened the awkwardness. "Harrington is indeed a keen sportsman," he said, his eyes still on Clara. "Though I confess, my thoughts have been rather elsewhere today." Eleanor's smile tightened, a fragile thing threatening to shatter. "Indeed. One might think your thoughts would be entirely on our impending nuptials, my dear. The preparations, the guests. It is all rather overwhelming, isn't it?" She laughed, a brittle sound that grated on Alistair's ears. Mrs. Finch, strategically positioned for optimal eavesdropping, leaned conspiratorially towards a nearby dowager, her whispers like venomous little darts. "Did you see that? The Duke's eyes never left her. A positive fixation, I tell you, and so close to the wedding." Lord Harrington, ever the astute observer, ambled closer, a knowing smirk playing on his lips. "Ah, Eleanor, Alistair, such a charming scene. One might almost forget there's a wedding to plan. He paused, letting the implication hang in the air, then added with a pointed glance at Alistair. Some might say a man's true interests are often revealed in the company he keeps, rather than the company he's expected to keep. Eleanor's face paled, the carefully constructed composure beginning to crack. Her gaze, once dismissive, now sharpened on Clara, suspicion replacing polite indifference. The air crackled with unspoken accusations, with the weight of Alistair's blatant disregard for decorum. Clara remained impassive, her hands clasped in front of her, a picture of quiet defiance. Alistair felt a surge of defiant satisfaction. Let them talk. Let the whispers turn to roars. He had never been one to be swayed by societal expectations, and seeing Clara stand so unyielding amidst the swirling currents of gossip only solidified his conviction. "My interests," Alistair stated, his voice carrying just enough to reach Eleanor and Harrington, "are precisely where I choose them to be." He took a step closer to Clara, his proximity a silent challenge to Eleanor's claim. The scent of roses, mingled with the faint, clean scent of Clara's lavender sachet, filled his senses. He found himself wanting to reach out, to brush a stray curl from her temple. Eleanor, her pride wounded, finally snapped. "Perhaps, Alistair, it is time we discussed these interests of yours more privately." Her voice, though low, vibrated with barely contained fury. The garden party, once a scene of genteel pleasantries, had transformed into a public stage for a drama rapidly escalating. The unspoken feelings were now screaming, the scandal palpable to every keen eye present. The confession of the heart. The heavy oak door of Alistair's private study closed with a soft thud, a sound that seemed to absorb all the ambient chatter of the ducal estate. Lady Eleanor stood before him, her hands clasped loosely in front of her, her posture as impeccable as ever. There was no histrionic outburst, no raised voice, only a quietude that felt far more cutting than any shriek. Her eyes, usually a placid hazel, held a glint of something akin to polished steel. "Alistair," she began, her voice a silken thread, "we need to speak. Candidly." He leaned back against his desk, crossing his arms, a faint frown marring his brow. He had expected this, yet the calm certainty of her demeanour disarmed him more than any fit of pique would have. "About what, Eleanor? The wedding preparations are nearly complete." "Indeed," she replied, a faint, humourless smile touching her lips. "And yet your attention seems to be elsewhere." Or rather, on someone else. The air in the room grew suddenly thick, heavy with unspoken accusations. "Do you truly believe society is blind, Alistair? Do you imagine your fascination with Miss Davies goes unnoticed?" Alistair felt a prickle of irritation, a defensive heat rising within him. "My interactions with Miss Davies are merely that, interactions. She is a guest." Eleanor's gaze sharpened, piercing through his flimsy excuse. "A guest you follow with your eyes across every ballroom. A guest whose blushes you seem to find endlessly amusing. A guest for whom you neglect your own fiancé at every turn. Lord Harrington found it quite diverting to remark upon your newfound interests this morning, practically within earshot of my aunt." The mention of Harrington, the old fox, stirred a fresh wave of resentment in Alistair. He knew the man enjoyed fanning the flames of scandal, but to use Eleanor as his unwitting tool. "Harrington is a gossip," Alistair scoffed, pushing off the desk to pace the worn Persian rug. "And you are providing him with ample material. Eleanor countered, her voice still low, but imbued with an undeniable edge. My family's name, my reputation, our entire future. You are jeopardizing it all for what, Alastair? A fleeting distraction? A pretty face that resists your charms? Her words, though calm, felt like a succession of finely honed daggers. I thought we had an understanding, a future built on respect and shared ambition. But your behaviour these past weeks has shown me only a profound disregard. He stopped pacing, turning to face her fully. The truth of her words resonated with an uncomfortable clarity. He had been neglectful, careless even. The amusement he found in Clara's company, her sharp wit and disarming refusal to be impressed by his title, had overshadowed everything else. He had brushed aside Eleanor's quiet discomfort, convinced himself it was merely a temporary diversion, a pre-wedding indulgence. But looking at Eleanor now, seeing the genuine hurt beneath her composed facade, he could no longer deny the weight of his actions. The silence that stretched between them was fraught, punctuated only by the distant chime of a grandfather clock. It was in that moment, under the quiet scrutiny of Eleanor's disappointed gaze, that the last vestiges of his self-deception crumbled. It wasn't just fascination. It wasn't a mere challenge or a fleeting amusement. The thought of Clara, her vibrant presence, her direct gaze, her disarming honesty. It stirred something deeper within him, something he hadn't felt since his youth. An unsettling, exhilarating sensation that felt suspiciously like falling. He was in love with Clara. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, stealing his breath. All this time, he had been fighting it, denying it, rationalizing it away, but the truth was undeniable. He was hours away from marrying Eleanor, a woman he respected, a woman perfectly suited to be his Duchess, and yet his heart, foolish and defiant, yearned for another. Eleanor, he began, his voice rougher than he intended, the words catching in his throat. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not just a fiancée, but a woman he was about to profoundly betray. The magnitude of his emotional entanglement, the sheer impropriety of it, crashed down upon him. He had to make a choice, and quickly. The path ahead, whichever he chose, was fraught with scandal and heartbreak. The morning air, crisp and unusually bright for the season, carried the scent of late-blooming roses from the ducal gardens, intermingling with the nervous energy of 100 servants. Within the grand Gothic arches of St. Jude's, society's elite gathered, a vibrant tapestry of silk, lace, and polished brass buttons. Every pew was filled, every whispered aside a morsel of gossip savoured. Lord Harrington's earlier pronouncements regarding Alastair's newfound interests had circulated with the speed of wildfire, particularly among the more observant matrons. Mrs. Finch, perched near the aisle with a fan fluttering like a hummingbird's wings, barely concealed her eager scrutiny. Alastair stood at the altar, the weight of his ducal robes a familiar, heavy embrace. The stained glass windows above cast kaleidoscope patterns across the ancient stone floor, illuminating dust motes dancing in the shafts of light. His gaze drifted over the assembled faces, a sea of polite smiles and veiled curiosity. He saw the anticipation, the barely contained excitement of those witnessing a union of two formidable houses. Yet, a peculiar disquiet settled in his chest, a sensation he had dismissed as pre-wedding jitters, but which now felt distinctly like a premonition. Then, The organ swelled, a majestic, rolling tide of sound. The great oak doors at the back of the church swung open, and Lady Eleanor, a vision in ivory satin and pearls, began her slow, stately procession down the aisle. She was undeniably beautiful, her posture regal, her smile serene and perfectly composed. Her eyes, as they met his from the distant entrance, held a depth of affection and expectation that, in another man, might have elicited a powerful surge of devotion. For Alistair, however, a different current pulsed beneath his carefully constructed composure. His eyes, against his will, continued their sweep, past the dowager duchesses and the newly minted debutantes, past the military men and the landed gentry. And then he saw her. Tucked away in a side pew, almost obscured by the ample frame of Lady Agatha, was Miss Clara Thorne. She wore a gown of muted lavender, simple yet elegant, and her hair, usually confined, had escaped in a few soft tendrils around her temples. Her hands were clasped in her lap, and her gaze, unlike the others, was not fixed on the bride, nor on him, but seemed lost in the intricate carvings of the pew in front of her. Alistair felt a jolt, as if a silent bell had rung deep within him. He watched her, utterly transfixed, as Lady Eleanor drew closer, her train rustling softly against the marble. Clara, perhaps sensing his intense scrutiny, slowly lifted her head. Their eyes met across the hushed sanctuary, a silent, potent clash of wills and emotions. Her expression was unreadable, perhaps a flicker of surprise, then something akin to weary resignation, and finally, a defiant, unyielding directness. There was no flattery, no awe, no demure dip of the head. Just a raw, undeniable acknowledgement of his presence, and a challenge in the depths of her quiet strength. The world seemed to narrow to that single, piercing gaze. The vibrant colours of the stained glass, the expectant murmurs of the crowd, the majestic swell of the organ, all faded into a dull hum. Only Clara remained, her eyes the colour of a stormy sea, holding his. It was a confrontation, a silent battle waged across a crowded room, forcing his hand in a way he hadn't anticipated. Not on his wedding day. Lady Eleanor was only a few paces from the altar now, her arrival imminent, her life intertwined with his by the threads of duty and expectation. Yet Alistair could not tear his gaze from Clara, a woman of no fortune, no title, but possessed of a spirit that captivated him entirely. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he could not marry Eleanor without acknowledging the truth that now burned between him and Clara. He took a step forward, not towards Eleanor, but subtly, imperceptibly, as if trying to bridge the distance to Clara. The movement was slight, but it caught Eleanor's eye. Her serene smile faltered, replaced by a delicate frown of confusion, then hurt. "Alistair," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the music, a plea and a question woven together. He heard her, saw the pain cloud her beautiful face, yet his eyes remained locked with Clara's. The decision, long simmering beneath the surface of his propriety, now crystallized into an undeniable truth, and it was about to shatter the carefully constructed peace of his world. Love over obligation. The hushed reverence of the chapel was a stark contrast to the tempest brewing within Duke Alistair. Sunlight, filtered through stained glass windows, painted streaks of sapphire and ruby across the ancient stone floor, illuminating the expectant faces of the assembled gentry. Lady Eleanor, breathtaking in ivory lace and pearls, moved with an almost ethereal grace down the long aisle, her gaze serene, her composure impeccable. Every step she took was a beat closer to a life Alistair was expected to embrace, a life of duty and dynastic continuation. Yet his own eyes, despite the solemnity of the occasion, were not fixed on his elegant bride. They sought, with an almost compulsive urgency, the quiet corner where Clara Thorne sat. She was a mere shadow amidst the vibrant finery of the tun, her simple gown a testament to her lack of station, yet her presence, even from a distance, was a profound disruption. He caught her gaze, just for a fleeting moment, and in that brief connection he saw not pity nor flattery, but a quiet understanding that both thrilled and unnerved him. Lord Harrington's earlier pronouncements about Alistair's new-found interests echoed in his mind, and he could feel Mrs. Finch's scrutinising stare from the third pew, her fan almost vibrating with barely contained gossip. The organ music swelled, a majestic prelude to a union that now felt utterly hollow. Lady Eleanor was almost at the altar, her hand extended, a delicate offering to a man whose heart was suddenly, irrevocably, elsewhere. The officiant cleared his throat, a low rumble designed to command attention, but Alistair's voice, when it came, cut through the air like a blade. "Stop." The single word, uttered with unexpected force, reverberated through the hushed chapel. The organist's fingers faltered, the music dying in a discordant gasp. Lady Eleanor froze, her perfect smile slowly dissolving into a mask of bewilderment. A ripple of murmurs spread through the congregation, a collective gasp of disbelief. Alistair ignored them all. His gaze remained locked on Clara, who now sat rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her face pale. "I cannot," Alistair continued, his voice now clearer, stronger, though laced with an undeniable tremor. He turned, his back to the bewildered Lady Eleanor and the scandalized assembly. He faced Clara directly, his eyes burning with an intensity that seemed to strip away all pretense. "I cannot marry you, Lady Eleanor. My apologies, profound and sincere." A collective intake of breath swept through the chapel. Lady Eleanor's composure finally fractured. A single tear traced a path through her expertly applied rouge. Her lower lip trembled. The officiant, a man accustomed to the gravitas of his role, looked utterly flummoxed, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. "My heart," Alistair declared, his voice ringing with a newfound conviction that silenced the burgeoning whispers, "belongs to another. It has, against all expectation and reason, been captured by Miss Clara Thorne." Clara gasped, a small, choked sound. Heads swiveled, 100 pairs of eyes now fixed on her, searing her with their collective judgment. Mrs. Finch's fan snapped shut with an audible click. The scandal, raw and immediate, hung heavy in the air, a palpable entity. Alistair took a step, then another, moving away from the altar, away from his intended bride, away from the future that had been meticulously planned since his birth. He descended the steps, his boots echoing on the marble, each step a declaration, a severing of ties. He stopped before Clara's pew, reaching out a hand, his fingers brushing against her arm. "I know this is unforgivable," he said, his voice softer now, meant only for her, though the entire chapel strained to hear. "I know the implications, the whispers, the ruin this might bring. But I cannot live a lie. I choose you, Clara. I choose a future built on genuine affection, not obligation. I choose a life where my heart is truly invested." He turned to face the stunned assembly, his voice rising again, infused with a defiant resolve. "Let the world talk. Let them condemn. Miss Thorne will be my Duchess. My choice is made. The silence that followed was deafening, pregnant with the weight of shattered expectations and an audacious, unprecedented declaration of love. The air crackled with the energy of a society shaken to its very foundations.